Welcome to Chiropractic Science, where you get to hear interviews with leading chiropractic researchers from around the world. Hear about chiropractic research from the authors in plain English, not through the media, nor middleman. My name is Dr. Dean Smith, and I am the host of Chiropractic Science. I'm an associate clinical professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Health at Miami University. I'm also a chiropractor in Eaton, Ohio. My research interests relate to understanding how chiropractic affects motor control and human performance. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Drs. Imran Niazi and Kelly Holt. But before we get to the interview, I wanted to thank all of you who have subscribed to Chiropractic Science, and I'm especially appreciative to all of you who have contributed 5-star reviews on iTunes. iTunes reviews really help others find out about chiropractic science, so if you like the show, please take a second and write a review. It will support chiropractors everywhere. Here's a review from Rich Manley, DC, who says, "Excellent podcast. Thanks, Dr. Dean, for continually providing informative and interesting content with lots of doctors doing important research. You're doing the chiropractic profession a great service." Well, thanks, Dr. Manley, for your review, and I look forward to sharing your iTunes reviews to all of you who are out there in a future podcast. Please consider making a contribution to Chiropractic Science to keep these podcasts going. You can do so on our website either by making a donation or by purchasing the evidence-based patient education slides presentation at chiropracticscience.com. All right, on to the podcast. Imran Niazi received his BS degree in electrical engineering from Rifa University, International University, Islamabad, Pakistan in 2005, and his master's in biomedical engineering from the University of Lübeck, Germany in 2009. Later, he got his PhD under the supervision of Professor Dario Farina from Center of Sensory Motor Interaction, Health Science Technology Department, University of Aalborg, Germany in 2012. After working as a postdoc for a year, he moved to New Zealand in 2013, where he is currently working as Senior Research Fellow at New Zealand College of Chiropractic. He has an adjunct position at Aalborg University, Denmark, and Auckland University of Technology, New Zealand. He is interested in studying and understanding the altered mechanism of motor control and learning in neurological disorders to develop various technologies that can enhance the quality of life of these patients. He has successfully co-supervised 4 PhD and 31 master's theses and currently has 4 active PhD students. He has authored 46 peer-reviewed journal articles and 82 conference papers. His work has been cited more than 1,100 times, and he has an H-index of 16 according to Google Scholar. Over the last 10 years, he has received funding worth around US $1.5 million from various sources. He is currently working as a review editor for Frontiers in Robotics and AI, and reviewer for more than 25 engineering and neuroscience journals. Dr. Kelly Holt was a member of the 1998 inaugural graduating class of the New Zealand College of Chiropractic. Besides his chiropractic degree, he also holds a Bachelor of Science majoring in physiology and a PhD in health science from the University of Auckland. His PhD focused on the effects of chiropractic care on sensory motor function and falls risk in older adults. He has published work in a number of peer-reviewed journals that investigated the effects of chiropractic care on nervous system function and the reliability of vertebral subluxation indicators, and has won a number of international research awards. Kelly worked in private practice as a chiropractor for 10 years following graduation and has taught at the New Zealand College of Chiropractic since 2000, and is currently the Dean of Research at the college. Kelly was named Chiropractor of the Year by the New Zealand College of Chiropractic Alumni Association in 2012 and by the New Zealand Chiropractors Association in 2014. Drs. Niazi and Holt, thanks so much for coming on the Chiropractic Science podcast.
Great to be chatting today, Dean.
Thanks for having us, Dean.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to have you both on. First, we'll get started with how you became interested in becoming a chiropractor, Kelly.
Well, that really came from going to visit a chiropractor when I was probably about 10 years old. I had a lot of headaches as a kid. My mum dragged me along to a chiropractor, and funnily enough, it helped me with my headaches. So I got under regular care. I was going for a number of years. Then when I was finishing high school, I wasn't really sure about what I wanted to do. And my chiropractor said, well, why don't you become a chiropractor? Because we've got a college opening here in New Zealand next year. And he seemed to have a lot of fun. He obviously helped people because he helped me. So I thought I'd give it a go. And the rest is history.
Fantastic. Imran, how did you get to work with chiropractors?
As you introduced in your introduction, you said that I did my PhD in Aalborg. So during my PhD, which started in 2009 and I finished in 2012, in between somewhere, I think 2010 or 11, Heidi Harvick and Professor Benedict Murphy visited Aalborg University. They both had a friend/colleague who was my mentor in my PhD, Dr. Natalie. So they were visiting her, and they were doing a collaborative project. So, and the lab they were using was a lab where I used to spend most of my time during my PhD. And that was a neurophys lab where we used to have a very specialized equipment for some spinal reflexes, measuring spinal reflexes and other neurophys measures. So I was helping Heidi and Benedict Murphy for that collaborative project. So that's how I got introduced to, you can say, chiropractic research. And then from there on, because there was 2 to 3 weeks which Heidi and Benedict stayed in Aalborg. And during that time, I think Heidi and Benny both, more so Heidi is friendly nature, which initially attracted me, and then
Benedict's not friendly. Is that what you're saying?
no, Benny is. She's a classic. In a classic terms, like she's a a classical scholar like type, whereas Heidi is a bit more fun, and so that was my introduction to chiropractic. To be honest, to the world of chiropractic. Before that, I didn't knew even a profession existed. Initially, so that was my introduction to chiropractic. And then during our talks, during those 2 to 3 weeks, some of the measures which I was using during my PhD to look at spinal reflexes and then some of the cortical responses, we were trying to figure out, trying to look what kind of changes can occur pre and post of certain interventions. So those were the discussion I had with both Heidi and Benedict, which resulted, why not let's apply those measures for chiropractic care and see how chiropractic care affects central nervous system. So those were the initial talks. And then Heidi used New Zealand as a bait to attract me to her lab. New Zealand is, as we all know, that is an attractive place to be as a tourist to begin with. Those talks kind of morphed into some rough ideas around a project, and she invited me, and then I visited New Zealand during my PhD in 2011 for the first time. Then at the end of my stay, what happened is there's a group of master students which I was supervising at the time. They came down to New Zealand, and that was the beginning of it. And then it was a continuation for next couple of years. 2012, I came back. Another group of students came with another group of students in 2013 again. And then 2013, I think, I moved. I was looking for a new adventure in my life. Heidi had a position, so that's how I ended up at New Zealand College of Chiropractic.
So Imran, we were talking before we started recording, and one of the things that you mentioned was when you first saw the effects of chiropractic on some of these neurophysiological measures that you had already been investigating, it kind of caught you by surprise. Can you just speak for a moment about what you saw?
Yeah, so So as I said earlier, when Bernie and Heidi were visiting us, so the normal paradigm we use, what we say now, pragmatic design of chiropractic care, where you record a Meyer and then chiropractor gives a single session of chiropractic care to a participant, and then you Meyer post recording. So in the lab, I've been using those my years for past 2 years for my PhD, looking at the neuroplasticity of central nervous system at a spinal level. It's called a stretch reflex. So that's what we've been using to tease out if an intervention have an effect on a central nervous system, where it comes from. Is it cortical in nature or is it spinal in nature? So that particular test, if you see changes in those kind of leads towards, if the changes are, you see changes in that particular test, it leads to, the changes are happening at the spinal level. So normally what I have experienced at that particular time for past 2 years was you see single digit changes, if you see ever any changes for that matter. Whereas working with Heidi and Bernadette, like for each and every subject, the changes were in double figures, for example, to begin with, and then I remember, if my memory serves me well, we had a participant who changed, whose pre to post changes were about more than 100%, like it doubled that. So, and that was really. At the beginning, I kept that amazement to myself, and I was just questioning myself: is something wrong in the equipment? I have done something wrong, because that was not a unique. That is not the norm, or because after working with certain techniques, you get so accustomed to looking at the computer and those squiggly lines, as some people call them. So those changes were massive, and once I figured it out, that I tried my best, like looking all the equipment is working properly. Then I opened up slightly with Heidi and Bernadette and asked, "Do you mind explaining this witchcraft to me?"
Yeah.
Like, I don't see much happening. Yes, you guys putting your hands on spines, and and pardon me, at that particular time, that was my understanding, and doing few adjustments of the spine or certain spinal segments and what's happening. So so that was quite freaky slash like a jaw-dropping moment, like, okay, that can happen as well. So, and that created the interest as well. Like, those were the ice-breaking moments with me being just a lab assistant for Heidi and Benedict at the time. I think once we opened up both ways, and it was, Heidi was always probing me, but I was more on a shy side. So, but once I opened up with them, that was the start of our discussions.
Yeah, fantastic. Really like to hear that. Kelly, how did you initially get involved in research?
Well, really, it came from my time at college when I was a student. So that was back in the mid-90s, because one of my first teachers was Bernadette Murphy, who Imran was talking about, who is an amazing scientist and inspirational lady. And she taught us research methods. And in our course at the time, we had quite a large research component. And I really enjoyed doing the research study that I did back at college. So that was the very beginning. Then I got into private practice and was also giving back to the college, working in the chiropractic centre, and got dragged into a bit of teaching. And one of my other colleagues at the time, Randy Beck, he dragged me into a project he was doing. And we were doing this on Saturday mornings and in the evenings. It was just a bit of a hobby, but again, I quite enjoyed it. So started dabbling a little bit in research. And then Heidi came on board at the college in 2006, and we really got things moving. And she dragged me kicking and screaming into this research career and pushed me to do a PhD. And for the last 10 years, I've been full-time in research at the college.
Wow, fantastic. You both have published some fascinating articles in top journals such as Scientific Reports, Brain Sciences, Experimental Brain Research, European Journal of Applied Physiology, and many others. And today, what I'd like to do is talk about 4 of these articles and to discuss some important concepts such as neuroplasticity, falls, and sensory motor performance in particular. And the first paper is one about falls risk, and this is called The Effectiveness of Chiropractic Care to Improve Sensory Motor Function Associated with Falls Risk in Older People. And this was a randomized controlled trial. Could you give us an overview of the article, how it came about, and what results did you find?
Well, this really came from my PhD, and my PhD focused on falls risk, or more sensory motor function associated with falls risk in older people, and whether chiropractic care has an impact on it. You know, we know that falls are a major problem, major public health issue. You know, they cost society an awful lot of money, billions and billions of dollars in rehab costs and hospital costs, people being out of work, and lead to a lot of mortality as well. So, they're a very big issue. They impact on many families and lots of lives. And it made sense to me that if someone had issues with postural stability, that they'd be at more risk of falling. And if chiropractic care had an impact on nervous system function, then potentially that might influence someone's falls risk. If the nervous system was functioning better, maybe they were going to be at less risk of falling. So I wanted to investigate that in my PhD. And this trial you're talking about was the main RCT that I did in my PhD. So what we did with that is looked at 12 weeks of chiropractic care in a parallel group RCT, and the outcome measures that we were focused on was sensory motor function changes associated with falls risk. So this was things like joint position sense in the ankle. Another one we did was called the choice stepping reaction time, which is basically a measure that tries to recreate a compensatory step. So if you imagine that you're having a trip or a slip and you need to put your foot out quickly to stop yourself from going over, the choice step and reaction time is all about how quickly you can put that foot out as if you're doing a compensatory step. Something else we looked at was called the sound-induced flash illusion. And this was a bit of a left field outcome measure, but this is looking at multisensory integration. So we know with as we get older, some of our senses start to go downhill a little, and the way that we combine sensory information and turn it into a good representation of what's going on in our internal and external environment, the strategies and the ways that we do that changes. And what we know from some previous research is people who struggle to combine these different sensory modalities, they seem to be at more risk of falling. So the sound-induced flash illusion, it's all about the way that you combine audio and visual information and try to make sense of it. And I thought I'd throw that in there, even though it seems a little bit weird because it doesn't have an awful lot to do with the spine. But we thought if we have some sort of influence on sensory perception with chiropractic care, then maybe that will show up in this sound-induced flash illusion. We also looked at postural stability, so postural sway, and quality of life. And we did a 12-week trial, so 12 weeks of chiropractic care or 12 weeks of usual care. Looked at baseline, then 4 weeks and 12 weeks with these outcome measures. And we really wanted to see what was going to change with those. And I've got to say, as I was getting towards the end of this trial, I had no idea what to expect. I'd put a number of years into this, and I was preparing myself for a negative trial. Now, we hadn't looked at any of the results. I thought, well, maybe I've just wasted a number of years and nothing's going to come out of this. And then I started getting these letters from the patients in the trial, and that they actually did send letters in those days, which was quite surprising. but the letters were telling me about all of these amazing changes that had gone on in their lives that had nothing to do with falls risk, but they were thanking me for enrolling them in the trial and getting them under 12 weeks of chiropractic care. And these were weird and wonderful things. Like, remember one lady, she got her ability to swallow back. So she, for many, many years, she'd just been eating pureed food because she couldn't swallow anything that was chunky. And what she found very soon after starting the trial was that that her ability to swallow came back, and she could get back on a regular diet, which was just weird. And this was one of many letters that I got. So as we're getting to the end of the trial, I thought, even if it is negative, we've actually made a difference to these people's lives, which was really quite cool. But thankfully, when the results came through, we saw lots of changes in these outcome measures. So we saw an improvement in proprioception and ankle joint position sense. We saw a improvement in the choice step and reaction time, so they could take a step quicker, compensatory step. We even saw a difference in the sound-induced flash illusion. So chiropractic care seemed to alter multisensory integration, which was the first time I think anyone had showed that. And we saw a change in quality of life, the physical component of quality of life. So we had some really cool changes that came out of the study, and I was really happy when those all came through.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Was there anything out of the trial after you got the results that really kind of surprised you at all?
Well, probably one of the biggies was the sound-induced flash illusion, because this in previous research, no one had shown that it changes. It's a pretty robust outcome measure, and it's supposed to stay constant. It's a very reliable measure, and we saw quite a big change in that. So that one blew me away. And the other biggie was actually this choice step and reaction time, because what we found between baseline and 4 weeks, there was no real change at all. So chiropractic group and the control group, neither of them changed. But then between the 4 and 12-week assessment, there was this very big improvement in the chiropractic group, while the control group remained static. So that was kind of a biggie to me, seeing that sometimes we see changes in function that take longer than just a few weeks. Because if you're in practice, you get someone under care and not much changes in the short term, I think often what we want to do is dismiss them from care because we don't think it's working. But with this choice step and reaction time, that just highlighted to me that sometimes these changes take time.
Yeah, that's a great point, because a lot of the guidelines recommend 5 or 6 visits. If you're not seeing any noticeable change, then the suggestion seems to be, well, let them go. But this research is fascinating, that we may not see some of these changes initially, and it may take some time.
Yeah, that was the biggie for me, and it's something that I try and share with our students. Is we see miracles in practice all the time, and we see people change very, very quickly. Just because you don't see that straight away, don't necessarily think that it's not working. It doesn't justify seeing someone forever and making no difference with them, but just be open to the idea that some things take time. Yeah, very good. Are you planning any further studies to look at fall risk in the elderly? About once a year, I consider doing a large-scale RCT. And then when I think about the resources that it will take, financial and human resources, I tend to bump it back a year. So I'd love to do it one day, but just with our group, we're a fairly small group, and we tend to have 30 or 40 projects on the go at any one time. And I'm just thinking, if we do a large clinical trial like that, that's really going to suck our resources dry. So I'd love to do it one day, but I've just recently bumped it back another year.
Yeah, I know the feeling for sure. Well, the next three studies that I'd like to talk about, they all involve the same methodology, but three different populations. Before we get into these studies, I'd really like it if you could talk about some of the core concepts dealing with these methods. In particular, there are a few neurophysiological techniques that you're using, H reflexes, for example, V waves, M waves. If you could give us an idea of how you might go about measuring these things and what the heck do they tell us?
Yeah. So, Dean, as I said earlier, when I met for the first time Heidi and Benedict in Aalborg, these were the very first study we will talk a bit down the track is the output of that initial discussion we had in Aalborg, or that was the foundation stone for that particular project. Later down the track, Professor Kemal Turker, who's now settled back in his home country of Turkey, who has spent about 28 years in University of Adelaide. He got involved. That's a story in itself, how we roped him in. That Heidi says that, yeah, that's a work of 5 years of constantly showing up to different conferences and talking to these big wigs and, picking out their brains around these methods. Let's get into, let's take H reflex for that, Maria. So when we look at any intervention and what in a basic science paradigm or in a neuroscience, we are most of the time are interested. If you see a change because of any intervention, then it's good to have a change. Then next thing you are interested in is where the change is originating from. Is it cortical in nature or is it at spinal nature? So as biomedical engineer, I was once told, think of it as an algebraic problem. So A plus B equal to C. So A is your, let's say, cortical input, B is your spinal input, and C is the total output. So it's good to have a change in your total output, but we are interested in what contribution is, what portion of changes are coming from where they are originating from, because that explains underlying mechanism further. For example, so H reflex, which is an analogous of spinal a stretch reflex, which is a mechanical one. So you could replicate stretch reflex in electrically in human participants. You could do you can do that test with human participants as well, but you need a very sophisticated machinery to evoke stretch reflexes, because you have to stretch the particular joint at a certain speed and with a certain velocity and all that. So if you do not have access to that particular equipment, then another equivalent test is what we call H reflex, which is you could evoke, and how you do that, you stimulate the mixed nerve of a particular muscle you are interested in. You place surface EMG electrodes on that particular muscle, and then what you start, the nerve which is innervating that muscle, you start electrically stimulating that. And what happens when you stimulate, there is a spinal reflex. So in the lower motor neuron parts of that area, the electrical stimulation is given. It goes back to it completes a small loop. It goes back up to your spine and comes back to the muscle. So there's a small circuitry which it gets evoked, and you measure that through your surface EMG electrode which you have placed over the muscle. So you record that, and if you keep increasing the intensity of your electrical stimulation, there's two phenomena called dromic and antidromic effect. So and once the dromic effect is gone and the antidromic overtakes that phenomena, so what you are getting is purely the drive which has been coming from the cortical region or from the cortex, it's believed. There is slight controversy in the literature that the origin of these changes are purely cortical, or there are other supraspinal mechanisms which are involved in that. But there is a consensus that it is a representation of your cortical drive. So that's how you do your V waves. And if you combine V wave, H reflex, V wave, and then you add in force measure, like calculating how much force is produced by a particular muscle, then combining the information gathered from all these three measures, you could talk about what's happening in the spinal circuitry, or in general what's happening at the central nervous system. And not only you could look at the changes, but also you could speculate, or you could make some inferences where those changes are coming from. So next three studies which we will be talking about use the same methodology: H reflexes, V waves, and the force. And the thing is, again, the basic question here is, does chiropractic have a neuroplastic effect? And before we go on and explaining these things, just want to, the definition, I got often seen that what is a neuroplastic change? So the typical definition is, if there is a change in a central nervous system and it outlasts its session, that's when you can call an intervention that it have a neuroplastic effect. For example, if a session happens for a half an hour and you can measure at the beginning and then at the end the change still persisted, then you can say there is a neuroplastic effect. So that's our starting point. So the first question is, does it have a neuroplastic effect? Number two, if there is an effect, is it cortically driven or is it spinally driven? H reflex would tell us about the spinal nature of a change, and V wave combined with the force measures would tell us about the cortical nature of the changes, neuroplastic changes. And another common factor in all these three studies is the study design. I would say it's from chiropractic point of view, it's quite pragmatic. From neurophys measures point of view, it's a crossover design where you measure pre-post of an intervention, which is in our particular case is chiropractic care. And in the crossover session, they would receive the control session. And in control session, normally what we do is, I think Kelly can speak more what we specifically do.
It's really just a passive movement control. Yeah. So we run through really a chiropractic exam, moving them around in the way that we would when we're going to adjust them. And then we set them up, maybe side posture, maybe supine prone, as if we were going to adjust them, but put in no thrust. So we're trying to take into account the time that's involved, the touch, and also probably the vestibular changes that come with getting people up and down and those sorts of things.
Yeah. So these are the so you get that as in an intervention center, you get the full pragmatic chiropractic care, or what Kelly just explained as a control. So you measure pre, post, in one session in intervention, one session as control, and then and another aspect which we I think I have now recently seen gets highlighted a lot is around the contextual factors as well. Like, and one thing I would like to tell to our listeners is in any good training of neuroscience methodology, it's part and parcel, or it's considered, it's part of our DNA that we are taught these things. Like in experimental condition has to remain very similar, except the particular intervention you are changing. So in our case, how the clinical interaction of how chiropractor interact with the participant in one session is, or it remains same how he or she would interact with the participant in a control session, for example. And so this is another aspect which I would like our listener to keep in mind. Sometimes we do not, or in not sometimes, in past we haven't emphasized it when we have published these papers. So the very first paper we will talk about haven't been mentioned before, but that was something we have we always take care. But now in our recent articles we have started to put it in writing in the papers as well, to put at ease some of these criticism we sometimes often raised at these studies as well. So coming back, so you record it pre, post, and then you look at what's happening. So I think that sets you up for nicely for these 3 studies. And should we move on? So let's talk about the first study. So the first study was what we call a subclinical population. And before I move further, if you think of any disease, there is a spectrum. So it's not that someone overnight transition from a healthy human being to full-blown pathologically patient, for example. So how we see at our research center is there is this spectrum. So you have these very healthy people, then what we call, there's another group, what we call subclinical. It's a thing which have exist in neuroscience and other literature as well. So these are the people who have some issues, ongoing issues, but they have not sought any care for that particular problem. So it comes and goes. It feels like it resolves itself in a few days or a few hours, depending what condition it is. But these are the people earlier on the spectrum, and then you go on acute and then chronic, full-blown pathological model of the patient. So this first study was done in this specific group, what we call subclinical group. So that's the thing about that group. And then there is another rationale, and which we often get criticized for as well, is we don't use pain population, for example, in our studies to look at because that's what chiropractic is mostly known for, that chiropractic affects pain. So why don't you look at the mechanisms in those populations? But one thing we often forget is pain in itself is a big confounding factor. So the thing about subclinical, or the niche about the subclinical population, is these are the people who have the similar symptomology as far as physiology is concerned, but when we are recording on the day, they don't have pain. Because if you have a pain, and if you see changes in the pain, which we very well know the chiropractic care helps a lot, just changing the pain would change all these neuroplasticity. Then you are not sure what are you after. Was the change because of the chiropractic care, or was it just because the pain has reduced? So that's why you are seeing changes in these basic in these neuroplasticity, for example. So to tease out that level of detail, we deliberately choose this subclinical population. So the day when we are testing them, they are not in pain. So if you see any change in the neuroplasticity, we can infer that the changes are because of the chiropractic care, not just because now pain is reduced, and when pain is reduced, you are seeing those changes. So in this first study, that was we measured this H reflex and V wave, and we had the force measures as well. As I've explained you before, pre and post design. In our chiropractic care or our intervention group, what we saw a change in force, which we measured both with EMG, which is not the best of the measures, using EMG as a measuring the force, but we accompanied that with the force transducer as well. So we were measuring how the force is produced in the muscle as well. So while subjects were doing these maximal contractions, we were measuring the EMG as well as their torque or the Newton they were producing through the load cells to measure the absolute force, if I can call it. Another niche thing about all three studies is the methodology to do H reflex, and that's where I would like to bring in the contribution of Professor Kemal Turker I mentioned earlier, because H reflex is a very sensitive measure. As our listener, and you can recall, I said how you evoke H reflex is you electrically stimulate the mixed nerve innervating the muscle. Depending on your joint position or how you are orientating or posturing your muscle, that mixed nerve position changes, and once its position changes, it changes the it changes the output of the H reflex as well. You could see a nice H reflex at a certain angle. Let's take an example of soleus muscle, for example. At a 90 degree, if you are sitting, like as you sit in your chair, and your thighs and your shin muscles, and they are at 90 degree, you evoke it. But let's now stretch our legs straight, for example, and then use the same intensity. You will not get the same output of the H reflex. So it's very sensitive measure. So Professor Kemal Turker, back in his days in the University of Adelaide, with some of the pioneering of this field, people like David Burke, and they have developed this methodology how to reliably evoke H reflexes. Before that, it used to be done just at one intensity, whereas in the methodology which Professor Kemal and his colleagues developed, it's an input-output curve, which means you not only stimulate at a motor threshold, which is M wave, but you stimulate at sub-thresholds and are also at the above super threshold as well. So you get the whole picture, and you get this S-like. If you have the paper in front of you, you would see there is this S figure, or what we call sigmoidal figure. So you look at the lowest possible intensity, and your 130% of your mx, and you divide it into 16 different steps, and at each step you give 3 different stimuli. So that by using this methodology, you are very sure that in that particular session, what you are capturing is the true representative of the spinal circuitry of that particular participant at that particular moment. And the nice beauty about this methodology is what I earlier told you, like if you change your posture or change the position of how your muscle is orientated, irrespective, even we still keep it similar, but even if it has changed, the beauty with this method is you could replicate that process. So that's why when Heidi invited me for the first time in 2011, that was the study we did here. Professor Kemal also came from Turkey at the time, so he was in the lab making sure what we were doing is too representative of his work, which he has amassed over last 10, 15 years of his, or 20 years of his research, for example. So that's some of the thought processes which have gone in the very first studies, and then which have continue in the second and third study we will be discussing.
Okay, great. What specifically did you find in that first study regards to the H reflex and M wave?
So as it, again, if as I said that the methodology we use to evoke H reflex is this input-output curve or sigmoidal curve, or in a very layman's term, it's like a S-shaped curve. So what you do, you evoke it at a pre-session, like before your intervention or control session, and then you evoke the similar H reflex phenomena post-session. And what you do, you superimpose these two lines over each other and look at what are the differences. So we know from previous neuroscience literature that if you see the different phases of this S-shape-like curve represent different states of our central nervous system, or what it represents, for example. So what we observed is that there was a slight shift towards the left, which means our lower threshold motor units, the net excitability of that have changed. So that if you see that shift from pre to post towards left, that's what it indicates. So we found a significant change at the lower or that beginning part of the curve. So that was the changes we observed in the H reflex. In the force or in the V waves, we showed, I think it was about 45% change, if my memory serves me well, in our control group or in our intervention group, and whereas in the control group, this V wave have gone down 23 or 24%. So it is moving in completely opposite direction. In intervention session, it is increasing by 44% or 45%, whereas in control group, it is going down in a negative direction about 24%. So that was a highly significant change which we observed. And also what we looked at the force and if you look at force production by EMG, and as I tell, it's not the best of the measure, but still some to that we saw 60% changes. But when we look at the absolute force changes, it was about 16% changes in our intervention group, and whereas similar phenomena happen in the absolute force that the control group went in the opposite direction, meaning it decreased by about 12%. So summarizing, in H reflex, we saw a shift towards the left. V wave, we saw V and forces, we saw a percentage increase in a positive direction, whereas in the control group, we saw a decrease in the V wave in a negative direction for control group. So, and that's why at the beginning I took a bit of time to explain those three measures. So on its own, these three things tells you a snippet or something, but you cannot be confident about claiming some changes. But when you put these three jigsaw puzzle or measures together and then try to make a sense of it, what it tells, definitely we do see a neuroplastic change in the central nervous system. The second is where the origin of this change comes from is based on V waves. It's very rarely it happens that a measure can be a purely cortically driven or a purely spinally driven. Our result shows it's mainly cortically driven. When we combine the results of V wave with force, absolute force measures. If we take out the force measures, then it can be controversial, but we have shown that V wave alongside the absolute force measure, we can say, yep, more contribution was coming from the cortical origins. That was all good. So that was the main parameters we were after. But then also, because we were recording EMG, we were just interested in another measure, which is fatigue. And fatigue, electrophysiologically, one way of measuring in a particular muscle is looking at the median frequency of your EMG. So in normal cases, a non-fatigue muscle's median frequency is in the range of 150 or to 200. So somewhere between 120 to 200, if you record EMG at high intensity contraction levels, you would see the median frequency to be somewhere around between 120 and 200 hertz. If a muscle starts to get fatigue, you would see the shift of this median frequency towards left, meaning reducing. And if it reduces below 50 hertz, then it's quite acceptable in neuroscience literature and basic motor control literature as well, that it is true representative of muscle being fully fatigued. What when we did this kind of if I can call it a secondary, like that was not our primary measure, but when we look at that measure, we did see shift. So we didn't see the change in the median frequency in our intervention group, whereas in our control group, we did see that this median frequency moved towards left, meaning starting to be fatigued. And that explains why we saw a decrease in the force production or in the control group. So so these were the few outcomes, parameters we measured, and that's what they showed.
Well, that's great. And I appreciate you going through those explanations. I know that's going to help a lot of people to try to understand these studies. So the next study was done in a group of athletes. Can you tell us, now that we have the methodology down, can you tell us what the principal findings were of that study?
So when we finished the first study, one thing I will just briefly like to mention, Kemal took it, and that is one of those moments as a scientist you are looking for when we finally did the whole analysis. And keep in mind again something we couldn't put in writing, but that was part of it was all done blindly. I was the guy who did an analysis of that, and I was blinded to the grouping, for example. But after being in lab for 2 weeks, and because we were in New Zealand for only a month's time, so we had to do the whole project. And during that point, when we finally got the results, and Kemal said, "Oh, so Kemal is also." A bit slight segue here is when he finally came to New Zealand and he saw us, okay, so you guys just gently, you are nice to people. So that's his thing towards to Heidi or to chiropractor, because you are nice, that's why you see these changes. There is no physiological truth to that, because he's one of the very old school skeptical guy, hard to convince unless you show him real hard data, for example. So that's why he flew all the way from Turkey to New Zealand to make sure things are done properly. And if his name is on the paper, he wanted to make sure that he was there and he could fully rely on that thing. So he said one line, so when you do your thing, so you see changes in the or you see the changes in the net excitability of low threshold motor units. So if that's the case, you should test it in people who have pathologies, people like stroke. And Heidi had a big laugh at that point. I said, and I hope people understand that Kemal who's not chiropractor, he doesn't understand at that time. Even I was naive that why Heidi was laughing. Then she explained that there is a connotation of chiropractic care and stroke at that time, that rather than looking as an intervention to help stroke, you guys are blamed for causing it. And so Heidi almost got her microphone and said, can you say it again, and recorded that. So that's the genesis of the next two studies. So from there, once the results got published, that gave us the motivation. Okay, it's good to have it in a subclinical population, but would we find similar changes in a full, as I said at the beginning of my explanation, in the spectrum of health, you have the subclinical and then you have full pathology. So that's the genesis of the stroke study. But in between came graduate student, a student from Denmark who wanted to visit us and do a research project. And in this project, but he was interested in athletes. So that was how this came into being. And the results of that study was, so we conducted a similar methodology in elite taekwondo players. And when I say elite, I think most of them had minimum 4 gold medals at international, at world competition levels. So these were really high elite taekwondo athletes. What we did, we made the same pre, post, and this time we didn't record it in only at the post, but we went even further. We recorded at post 30 minutes of cessation of the intervention, and also at 1 hour point as well. Again, as you see, or we often get, you see these immediate changes, how long they last. So this is the genuine question, and that's why we were interested, not only looking at the immediate changes, but also at 30 minutes and 1 hour. Again, what we saw, a massive increase in V wave. I think our V wave in this particular, so we saw a similar trend that V wave alongside the absolute force measures increased in our intervention group, whereas in our control group, it decreased. The V wave / the absolute force went down in a negative direction. We didn't see any changes in the H reflex in this particular population. So that was an interesting finding. What we found out that even in these elite athletes, we had changed their absolute force, I think on roughly around 8%, if I recall well. Yeah. Which is, it's not huge when you look at just from a number of terms, but think of these are, as I was trying to emphasize the fact that these are elite athletes. For them, there is a phenomenon in neuroscience or in generally in motor control literature, what you call ceiling effect. They're already at their peaks, for example. So to consistently see a change of that level of change, that was quite amazing to see, and that's just on the basis of one session of one session of chiropractic care. So yeah, so they have pretty much repeated the results of the previous study, but this time in elite athlete groups. And also the changes lasted not only immediately, but they lasted post 30 and post 60. Unfortunately, at post 60, we didn't have statistical significance, but they were still, if you look at the slope of the trend, it was increasing. So they were increasing still.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And from a behavioral standpoint, maybe a practical standpoint, do you think athletes who get adjusted at events, let's say, do you think that's part of what they're perceiving as this increase in MVC, increase ability to perform? You think that's part of what they're getting out of this?
Possibly. And then another fact, I think, and right now I'm struggling to answer your question, is because of this very nature of the two sciences. I would like to point to our listeners is as a basic scientist, and what's the difference between a clinical scientist. As a basic neuroscience person, it's very hard for us to make, so to be certain about anything and then make certain recommendation. Our language is quite what's the word non-certain, if I can say. Whereas in clinical term, which you are asking me, is that might be the case that in a that would that be the thing? Possibly yes, but I would say we would have to do the clinical stuff, clinical study to confidently say yes. But we do have good evidence from basic science experiments. Yes, there is a possibility that that might be the case, that as elite athletes can use chiropractic care before their competition, and that might possibly give them a slight edge, because in these high level performances, the differences of winning and losing is microseconds to few minutes. So I don't know if Kelly wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I think Imran's been really cagey here because definitely the results of this study hint at that, and that may be what's going on. What we sometimes find is that people will take the results of our studies and run with them, and we see on the internet things that we haven't said, which are going out to the general population, which we can't back up with what we've done. So, we certainly need to do more work there just to see, how clinically relevant these things are. But it most certainly could be that these athletes are actually stronger after their adjustment, and it does impact their performance. But, obviously more work to do there.
Sure. And I think that actually transitions nicely into our last paper that we're going to talk about. And this does deal with the clinical population of stroke patients. Again, the methods are the same here. So what did you find in this study?
Pretty much the replication of the previous two studies. So we did see changes in the V wave, and we did see changes in the absolute measures. The mind-boggling, again, one of those moments was like in this time, keep in mind, these are chronic stroke patients, and I will come back a bit to explain. But for now, we saw in absolute force production, I think we found on average about 65% changes in chronic stroke population during the intervention session. Whereas in their control session, again, they followed the same path. They went down significantly with about 27% decrease in their absolute force production. And again, in their V wave, I think we had the similar changes that it increased during the intervention session and decreased in the control session.
Okay.
So we had the similar results.
No real H reflex change.
No, so no H reflex. So if now we combine the three different studies, so first study in the subclinical population, we did see some changes in H, but the consistent finding in all three studies is changes in the V and absolute force, which when you combine these two together leads us to the conclusion the neuroplastic changes are occurring, and they are occurring mainly cortically driven. Not to rule out that there are no spinal component, but our data suggests the changes are cortically driven, and they last up to an hour, which leads us nicely, gives us nice data if we want to continue on a clinical study.
Okay, yeah, great. Now I want to get into the neuroplastic effects here and some of those issues. But before I forget, I also wanted to ask, as you're going through your literature review and writing up the paper for the stroke study, have the same methods been used in other studies, like to look at the production of force in the various muscles? And then as a follow-up to that, what have any other previous studies that have used similar methods, like what's the intervention effect? How large is the effect from anything like exercise or touching somebody on the leg? Do we have anything that we can compare it to? Because these just sound amazing, like huge effects.
So, from methodological perspective, again, which I said earlier, the methodology for H reflex or V wave, the methodology we use, which is we learned from Professor Kemal Turker, is quite robust. And now I'm trying to recall. I think we didn't. If there were changes, they were of very small. Keep in mind, these are single session studies. Most of the time, in stroke population, very rarely you see a single session studies. But those, not the similar methodologies, but some, if I can say, the sister or the cousin methodologies, they do find some changes, but in a very moderate effect sizes, or very small, something in range of single digit or max at 10% or around 10 to 15%, for example.
There was that one study where they did 3 weeks of exercise training, wasn't it?
Yeah, so that was, again, I think it was effect of endurance training. I remember it's Carolina, one of my colleagues from Denmark. She was the lead author on that, and my supervisor, Dario Farina, were involved in that particular paper. But I think it was it's a while back. But yes, they looked at the changes in these particular measure H and V waves. 3 weeks of strength training and or endurance training, and the changes we observed in our population were more.
They were about the same. That first study
was quite similar. So, but keep in mind, this was not in a stroke population. That was in a so-called a healthy population where they were looking at the effect of strength and endurance training. So, coming back to your question, not that I can recall any particular study right now, but in generally in neuroscience, you rarely see a single session intervention giving such a big amount of changes.
Sure, yeah. And that's a really good point to bring out, that perhaps other studies haven't looked at it. Maybe they should. Based upon your study, maybe they should start checking that out. One thing that I want to come back to, and I think this is a really important thing to discuss, and this is about the effects, the neuroplastic effects. One thing that I've been in discussions with other people about is these neuroplastic effects seem to be short-lasting, and maybe that's just a consequence of how long we measure them for, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, couple of hours afterwards. But just because they're short-lasting doesn't necessarily mean they're clinically unimportant, does it?
Yep. So the most of the time, how we encounter is, I think, and I would lead our listener towards earlier point which Kelly made during his clinical trial for step response. So, like, for first 4 weeks, he didn't see any changes, for example, but then the changes after 4 weeks, you started to see the changes. So we can take similar analogy. So there are two aspects. One is the clinical explanation of why it's not happening or why is it happening, and then there is a what we call logistical challenges. For example, most of these basic science studies are, the methodologies are very intricate and cumbersome to do, and analysis can take some time, a lot of time. So just for pragmatic logistical reasoning, we, as you have mentioned, we don't record for that long. Lack of funding, lack of human resource, and keeping in mind having a participant in your lab for more than 2 hours session bring lots of psychological changes, and that would start intervening with your method. So generally, there is a consensus in neuroscience that you should not have your participants in the lab for more than at max 2 hours, for example, because after that they get lots of different aspects starts to kick in, and that starts to becoming a co-founding factor in your Mayas, for example. So that's from the logistical point of view. From Neurophys point of view, I think that's how, if I look at the things world, that first in basic science or neuroscience literature, find these changes which are lasting certain period of time, and when the evidence gets accumulated over a period of time, you have done it in different population, that gives you the confidence, or let's look at this thing into a clinical population, for example, or in a clinical trial. So it could be, it is so for us, or from our point of view, before we go into a full-blown clinical trial, in chiropractic research, sometimes one of the downside is, it's, if we are looking at some things, sometimes we don't find a lot of data available based on which you could design your clinical studies. So these basic science findings help us gather some data, gather some basic rationale of how the mechanisms are at work, and then based on that, we could design and conduct a larger RCT, for example, or clinical trials.
Well, I think it will give you some job security. Studying these things for a long time.
No, that's a neat thing about chiropractic research. There's so much, it's like just blindly put your finger out there, and you still nothing has been done in that particular field, for example. So it's an amount of the amount of work ahead of us. I think we are good for a couple of centuries if only us who are doing it.
Well, I'll have to have you on maybe in a few years, and you can tell us about all the latest findings at that point.
That's a totally different discussion, but yeah, we are working on how we can work on those aspects optimally. But yeah, Kelly, so you.
Well, I was just going to point out that we have actually followed up that stroke study with the pilot clinical trial, which we're just going through the data analysis of at the moment. So we did that original stroke study over in Pakistan at a hospital, which was from Imran's university, where he did his undergraduate degree. They run this hospital, and it was a very interesting time going over there to do the study initially. But we went back earlier this year to follow up with a pilot clinical trial where we were looking at 4 weeks of chiropractic care with more sort of functional clinical outcomes. So movement-related outcomes, Fugl-Myers motor assessment, so motor control, looking at timed up and go in rehab settings. And we're just going through the data analysis now, so probably shouldn't say too much, but we've got some really cool results that are going to come out of that study, or those studies that we did earlier this year.
Cool. I look forward to reading those papers for sure when they come out. Well,
at this point, Dean, I would just like to mention one thing. One of the few criticism we often, I think Kelly mentioned that, lots of people take our research and run with it, and often that's what not we are saying. One of the criticism I often see was around stroke study, was again around the contextual factors, or the fact that it's hard to design a control or a sham session for a chiropractic care, because that's a challenge in general for any physical therapy. So how to design a control session. One of the niche thing with this cohort in Pakistan is, in Pakistan, chiropractic care is non-existent, or it doesn't exist. So people don't have any perception of what it is. So again, so these guys didn't have, and so for how we dealt with them is two different chiropractic. So chiropractor would see you 2 times, and they would use different techniques, and so we were able to, not fully, but able to create an close to a fully complied sham session, because at least, and then we also took care of this aspect, like, often because these people are in Pakistan, and then doctors from foreign country coming and taking care of them. We pay a very good amount of time in designing the protocol in such a way that control groups and the intervention sessions, they get similar clinical time with the chiropractors, or same person of same attire, so that all those psychological or contextual factors are kept very, we emphasize a lot on those, but it's very hard sometimes to put all those things in when you're writing a journal article and put it out there. But just I wanted to tell to our listeners is that's always at back of our mind, or when we are designing, these are the points where we mull over for long enough to make sure that as much as similar these two sessions can be, or those two interventions can be.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And I think it's worthwhile to mention that there's no single study that can do everything. And there's always going to be critiques, and you just try to do, the best you can. And in future studies, take those critiques and try to address. And we all strive to do that for sure. So, but I appreciate you going through that. It's an important comment to make. Before we close the call, I ask all of my guests who come on one question, and that is, if you were going to, if a student, let's say, asked you how it is they could go about pursuing a research career in chiropractic science and what advice you might have for them, what advice would you have for them? And we could start with either one of you.
I'd suggest that they connect with researchers. So get in touch with some researchers who are doing research that they like, and see what opportunities are there to work with them. Ultimately, if you really want to make a career out of research, you want to be doing a master's degree and a PhD. But if you can hook up with researchers in a lab or some sort of research environment, that's the best first step, because they'll be able to point you in the direction of a decent direction to go, and potentially help map out a pathway for you to become a researcher.
And that could be my personal bias, but I often, if we are having such chats, I often ask chiropractors to go back in practice, like after graduating, practice it for a while, because once you have done the clinical practice, I think that gives you a different perspective if you straight out of your chiro degree come into research. So that's not that we can enforce that, but often in our discussion, I often say to the prospective PhD students that rather than looking at it directly right after your DC or chiropractic degree coming to research, as I totally agree with Kelly's point, be in touch with them, but go out and practice and see in real life and create those, because once you are in practice, lots of clinical relevant questions would come up, for example, and that would start the internal discussion, like within yourself, how does it work, why it works, what are the things. So once you have seen that firsthand, I think it gives a personal touch or towards a scientific or research project, because often in research what you need is every morning you have to get up and be back into the lab. You need a reason. So if you can somehow get that reason, and different people would have different, but often once you have been in practice and you have seen improvements or stuff, that I have noticed that helps people carry through the hard times of research. Research is something it looks very pretty when you have published those 5-6 pages, but the amount of sweat and tears have gone in before that. To go through that process, you need a thing which will carry you through those time. And believe me, however much support structure you have, at the end of the day, it should be an inner calling, which should be leading the way. The support system can help you, but at the end of the day, it's you, the person, and the personal reason which makes you get up every day and go to the lab. So, and that's where, if you have been in clinical practice and you have seen that, I feel that helps. That would help chiropractic researchers of the future. And that's my personal bias, fully disclosing that.
Yeah, no, terrific advice. I appreciate both of your viewpoints, and certainly other researchers have shared that. And I really do like the idea of getting some practice in before you get into research. I do think it's important. I still like to practice while I do the research, and I know many researchers still do that. And for me, it works. And like you said, there's a lot of sweat and tears that go into it, just like there are for people who are in practice full time. Yes. It's, that's just the way it goes. But if you have that calling and you're interested, there's nothing better, it seems. So great. Well, fellas, Imran and Kelly, thanks for coming on today. Thanks for talking about your research. I've been wanting to get you both on for some time. So thanks for spending the time today and telling us about that, and for this great discussion.
Cheers, Dean. Good to chat.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. We'll have you back on, like I say, in a couple of years to learn all of the latest and greatest.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Chiropractic Science with Doctors Imran Niazi and Kelly Holt. Stay tuned for more great episodes.